It started with a phone call. A simple welfare check request, the kind police departments receive every day. But this one would uncover something no one in Burleson, Texas could have imagined. Officers arrived at a quiet home on White Oak Lane, a calm middle-class street where neighbors waved, lawns were trimmed, and the loudest noise came from passing cars. Nothing about this house stood out until that October afternoon. A tip had come in, a warning that a 26-year-old man named Jonathan Kinman might be dead. The caller didn't have all the details, just enough to make police uneasy. And so, as the sun hung low over the rooftops, Burleson officers knocked on the door of the Mitchell home. Inside lived December Mitchell and her husband, Jonathan Mitchell, the mother and stepfather of the young man in question. They greeted police calmly, almost too calmly. When asked about Jonathan's whereabouts, December hesitated. Then she quietly admitted he had passed away. That's when the first cracks in their story appeared. She said Jonathan had been taken to the hospital, that he was pronounced dead at Hughley Hospital. But detectives checked the hospital's records. There was nothing. No report. No file. No body. The officers returned, confused and suspicious. This time they looked closer. They searched the yard. And in the far corner, beneath a patch of disturbed soil, they found it. A shallow grave. Buried just a few feet beneath the surface was the body of Jonathan Kinman, the young man whose life had ended quietly, whose death no one had reported. Word spread fast. Police cars lined the street, flashing lights bouncing off neighboring homes. Residents stepped outside, whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. One neighbor, Judy Harris, remembered seeing the scene unfold. They were there all night, she said. One police car after another. 6 in total, and then 2 medical examiner vans. We didn't know what to think. For a community that prided itself on safety and neighborly trust, this discovery felt impossible. How could something so horrific be hidden for so long, right in their backyard? Investigators soon confirmed the victim was Jonathan Kinman, a man with special needs, born with a condition that affected his growth and health. He required consistent care, the kind only family could provide. And yet, the very people meant to protect him were now at the center of a criminal investigation. As forensic teams began their work, detectives struggled to piece together a timeline. How long had Jonathan been gone? How did he die? And why had no one reported it? The Mitchells' explanations changed with every question. First they said he died peacefully. Then they claimed they didn't know how to handle it. Finally, when pressed, they said they were afraid. But fear doesn't explain a secret grave. Fear doesn't explain silence. Neighbors who'd lived nearby for years admitted they'd never seen Jonathan outside, not once. Some didn't even know he lived there. That mystery deepened the heartbreak. Within days, December and Jonathan Mitchell were both arrested, charged with tampering with evidence and fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair a human corpse, a second-degree felony. As officers led them away in handcuffs, the only question that echoed through the neighborhood was why. And that question would lead investigators into a web of conflicting stories, medical histories, and a past that revealed far more than anyone expected. As investigators stood in the Mitchells' backyard, the sound of shovels striking dirt echoed through the night. Every scrape of metal against soil drew them closer to the truth. Underneath just a few inches of earth, wrapped in layers of plastic and cloth, lay the remains of Jonathan Kinman, a young man who had spent his life depending on others for care and safety. It was a discovery that stunned even veteran detectives. The way he was buried, shallow, hurried, hidden, told them one thing: someone wanted this to stay secret. Police sealed off the scene. Evidence markers dotted the yard. Floodlights cut through the darkness as neighbors watched in disbelief from behind curtains. To them, the Mitchells had always seemed quiet, almost withdrawn. They kept to themselves. December, the mother, was rarely seen outside. Her husband, Jonathan Mitchell, occasionally mowed the lawn, but few people really knew them. And as the truth emerged, everyone began asking the same question: who was Jonathan Kinman? Jonathan wasn't just another name in a police report. He was a young man with developmental challenges, described by relatives as gentle, trusting, and deeply dependent on his caregivers. Those close to him said he loved video games, cartoons, and small routines that gave him comfort. But behind closed doors, something had changed. Detectives learned that Jonathan's health had been declining in recent months. He had a condition that affected his growth and contributed to other medical complications. He required close supervision, medication, and frequent doctor visits. Yet no medical records showed recent appointments. No prescriptions had been refilled. No hospital visits. Nothing. It was as if Jonathan had quietly disappeared long before anyone came looking. Investigators began to suspect that his death didn't happen the way his mother claimed. The timeline she provided didn't match the evidence. First, she said Jonathan had died naturally and they panicked. Then she claimed she couldn't afford a funeral. But when officers pressed further, she offered a different story, that she believed someone else would take care of it. Each answer raised more questions. Why was there no death certificate? Why was there no emergency call? And why had they gone to such lengths to bury him in secret? Neighbors remembered unusual activity weeks before the discovery, strange odors coming from the backyard, bags of soil being delivered, and the couple keeping their lights off for days. One neighbor recalled, "They kept saying their son was visiting relatives. But I never saw anyone come or go. The house always looked empty." As detectives examined the shallow grave, forensic experts determined that Jonathan had likely been buried for weeks, possibly months. But pinpointing the exact time of death wasn't easy. Every new detail added to the heartbreak. This wasn't just a case of poor judgment, it was a deliberate cover-up. Police began reviewing phone records, text messages, and financial transactions. They discovered that after Jonathan's death, his parents continued using his benefits. That evidence became critical in building their case. When questioned again, December broke down. She admitted they hadn't told anyone about his death, but she still insisted it wasn't murder. She said they were scared, that they didn't know what to do. But investigators weren't convinced. Fear doesn't explain burying your son in your backyard. Fear doesn't explain silence for weeks. And fear doesn't explain pretending everything was normal. The community that once saw the Mitchells as private now viewed them with suspicion. Parents kept their children inside. News trucks lined the street. Burleson, a quiet town, was suddenly on every local broadcast. And as the story spread, more disturbing questions emerged. Did Jonathan die from neglect? Was it an accident? Or was there something darker behind the Mitchells' strange behavior? Detectives were determined to find out. They began reconstructing Jonathan's final days, tracing every phone call, every purchase, every clue that could reveal what really happened inside that home before the burial. What they uncovered next would turn the investigation from a case of concealment into a story of betrayal and unimaginable loss. Inside the Burleson Police Department, two suspects sat in separate rooms, a mother and her husband, both facing the same question: what really happened to Jonathan Kinman? The atmosphere was heavy. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. On one side of the building, December Mitchell sat with her hands clasped tightly, avoiding eye contact. On the other, Jonathan Mitchell, her husband, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to appear calm. Detectives had already reviewed their statements. They knew something didn't fit. When asked again about Jonathan's death, December repeated what she told officers earlier, that her son had died naturally at home. She said she panicked, called her husband, and together they decided not to alert anyone. But when pressed for details, when exactly did it happen? What time? Where in the house? Her answers shifted. Each time the story changed just slightly. Detectives noticed. Meanwhile, in the next room, Jonathan Mitchell was telling a different version. He said he had come home from work to find his stepson unresponsive. He claimed December had already wrapped the body, that she was distraught and begging him for help. But when investigators compared both accounts, the differences were impossible to ignore. One of them was lying, or both were hiding something. The lead detective paused the interview, stepped out, and whispered to his partner, "Something's off. They're not telling us everything. Not even close." Back inside the room, December began to cry. Her voice cracked as she described her son's final days. She said he hadn't been eating, that his breathing became shallow. That one morning, he simply didn't wake up. Detectives leaned forward. "Why didn't you call 911?" one of them asked softly. Her answer came after a long silence. "Because I thought no one would understand. I was scared they'd take me away." That statement hit hard, but it didn't explain the burial. It didn't explain the secrecy. When asked about the decision to bury him in the backyard, she looked down at the table and whispered, "We didn't know what else to do." But investigators had already uncovered evidence suggesting otherwise. Purchases made days after his death. Shovels, plastic tarps, and bags of soil from a local hardware store. That wasn't panic. That was planning. Meanwhile, Jonathan Mitchell claimed he was only trying to help his wife. He insisted it was her decision, not his. But when shown the receipts, his signature appeared clearly on one of them. His expression changed. The confidence faded. Detectives kept the pressure on. Hours turned into the early morning. Both suspects were exhausted, their stories breaking apart piece by piece. Then came the key moment. Investigators revealed they had recovered messages exchanged between the couple around the time of Jonathan's death. In one, December wrote, "No one needs to know. It's better this way." That message would later become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. As the interrogation continued, December admitted she hadn't told any of Jonathan's relatives what happened. His family, who lived out of town, had tried calling him, but she always had an excuse. "He's asleep. He's not feeling well. He's visiting friends." For months she maintained that lie. To the detectives, this was more than neglect. It was calculated silence. By the time the interviews ended, both December and Jonathan Mitchell were booked into the Johnson County Jail, each charged with tampering and fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair a human corpse, a serious felony under Texas law. As they were led away, reporters captured the moment on camera. The couple said nothing. No tears. No apologies. Just two blank faces illuminated by flashing lights. Meanwhile, the investigation was far from over. Detectives still needed the full autopsy report, the final piece that could determine whether Jonathan's death was truly natural, or something else entirely. The results would reveal shocking details about his condition, and raise even deeper questions about how long he had been suffering before anyone noticed. News of the arrest spread quickly. Within hours, headlines across Texas carried the same chilling words. Couple charged after son found buried in backyard. For many, it was just another tragic headline. But for one family, it was a nightmare come to life. The Kinman family, Jonathan's biological relatives, hadn't heard from him in weeks. They'd called, texted, and even reached out on social media, but there was never a response. Each time they asked, December had an explanation. She said Jonathan was resting, that he didn't like talking on the phone much anymore. But now they knew the truth. When police confirmed that the body found behind the Mitchells' home belonged to their beloved Jonathan, grief swept through the family like a storm. In a public statement, they said, "We were horrified to hear the news about our precious Jonathan. This is a living nightmare for our family. Please know we are in full cooperation with law enforcement, and we will fight for every last ounce of truth and justice to come to light for the sake of our sweet boy." Their words carried both heartbreak and determination, a vow that Jonathan's life and his death would not be forgotten. Family members described Jonathan as gentle and pure-hearted, a young man who faced challenges but never lost his spirit. He had a soft laugh, a love for cartoons, and an innocence that made everyone around him protective. One cousin recalled, "He didn't care about material things. He just wanted company. He wanted to be seen." That statement cut deep, because for months Jonathan had been invisible to the world, hidden away even from those who loved him most. The family wanted answers, and they wanted accountability. They questioned how someone so dependent could vanish for so long without anyone noticing. Why weren't authorities alerted sooner? Why did it take a tip for the truth to come out? Meanwhile, the Burleson Police Department continued their work quietly but meticulously. They were waiting for the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's report, the official autopsy that would determine Jonathan's exact cause of death. Detectives hoped it would bring clarity. The family prayed it would bring justice. As the days passed, news crews camped outside the small beige house on White Oak Lane. Reporters described the once quiet street now surrounded by yellow tape and flashing lights. Neighbors avoided walking their dogs near the property. Some left flowers by the mailbox, a small tribute to a young man none of them truly knew. One neighbor said softly to a reporter, "He deserved better. If it was natural causes, there was no reason to hide it. They could have called for help. They could have done the right thing." That became the question echoing across the community: why didn't they? While the Mitchells sat behind bars awaiting further investigation, the Kinman family began the painful process of reclaiming Jonathan's remains. They wanted to give him a proper burial, one filled with dignity and peace, the kind he never got in life. In a quiet service, surrounded by relatives and close friends, they said goodbye. There were no TV cameras there, no police lights, just tears and memories. His cousin read a passage he used to love, about kindness, forgiveness, and the belief that truth always finds its way to light. But as they laid him to rest, questions still lingered. The autopsy report had not yet been released. Detectives still hadn't determined if his death was accidental, medical, or caused by neglect. And without those answers, the community's unease continued to grow. Was this simply a case of fear and bad decisions? Or was there something deeper, something that spoke to a lifetime of quiet suffering that no one ever truly saw? For Jonathan's family, the mission was now clear. They would not stop until the full truth was revealed. As the investigation entered its next phase, police began uncovering financial records, text messages, and timelines that painted a more complex picture. One that would soon challenge everything the Mitchells had claimed. Weeks after the arrest, the investigation reached a turning point. Detectives finally received the autopsy report from the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office, a document that would answer the question haunting everyone. How did Jonathan Kinman really die? The results were devastating. The report confirmed what detectives had suspected. Jonathan's body showed signs of severe neglect. He had been malnourished, underweight, and suffering from multiple untreated medical conditions. There were no immediate signs of violent trauma, but the state of his body told a story of prolonged suffering. A slow, silent decline. To investigators, this wasn't just a tragic death. It was a failure, one that pointed directly to the people who were supposed to care for him. Jonathan had lived with a developmental disability that made daily life challenging. He needed support, meals prepared, medication administered, and routine medical visits. But the evidence showed those needs hadn't been met for months. In interviews with former neighbors and acquaintances, detectives learned that no one had seen Jonathan outside in nearly a year. The curtains in his room were always drawn. Deliveries came and went, but there was little sign of life inside. And then came the detail that would shock even seasoned officers. Financial records revealed that after Jonathan's death, his parents, December and Jonathan Mitchell, continued to collect his disability benefits. Deposits were withdrawn regularly. The money was spent on groceries, bills, and personal expenses. For investigators, that was the final confirmation. This wasn't panic. This was deception. It meant that not only had they buried their son, they had profited from his absence. When confronted with the evidence, December's attorney issued a brief statement, claiming she had made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to handle the situation. But police believed the planning, the secrecy, and the lies told a different story. The grave in the backyard wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate attempt to erase Jonathan's existence. As word of the autopsy spread, the Kinman family broke down once again. Their statement was brief but powerful. He was a gentle soul. He trusted those around him completely. He deserved care, not silence. Justice must be done. Community outrage grew louder. Social media filled with messages from strangers. People who'd never met Jonathan but felt connected to his story. They demanded accountability. One local resident wrote, "If it was natural causes, you call for help. You don't bury your child in the backyard and pretend nothing happened." Burleson police confirmed that the case was now being reviewed by the Johnson County District Attorney's Office for possible additional charges. Detectives weren't ruling out neglect or abuse, depending on what prosecutors could prove. Behind the scenes, investigators reconstructed Jonathan's final months. Medical records stopped abruptly 6 months before his death. Phone records showed no emergency calls. And online searches from the couple's computer revealed chilling terms. Questions about decomposition, burial, and legal consequences for unreported deaths. Each new discovery made the case darker, heavier, and harder to comprehend. To understand the timeline, detectives mapped out everything. When Jonathan's health visibly declined. When contact with his relatives stopped. When the purchases for soil and tarps were made. And when neighbors first noticed the smell coming from the yard. Every date lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. The burial had been planned. The silence had been chosen. For many, the hardest part wasn't the crime itself, but what it represented. A young man who spent his life depending on others for love and protection had been failed by those closest to him. Detectives later revealed that if the tip hadn't come in when it did, Jonathan's body might never have been found. The couple's plan, quiet, careful, and cold, had almost worked. As the community grieved, prosecutors prepared their next move. The Mitchells were facing serious charges, but the family wanted more. A charge that would reflect the depth of what had been done. For the Kinmans, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, the truth their son never got to tell. They wanted the world to know who Jonathan was before his name became part of a crime headline. They described him as joyful, curious, and innocent, someone who saw good in everyone. And that became the most painful part. Because even in the final months of his life, Jonathan likely never stopped believing that his caregivers loved him. The investigation was nearly complete. But one final stage remained, the court proceedings that would determine whether December and Jonathan Mitchell's actions were fear-driven mistakes, or crimes born from something far colder. Months after Jonathan's remains were found, the case reached the courthouse steps. For the first time, December and Jonathan Mitchell appeared before a judge, faces pale, eyes empty, surrounded by whispers and cameras. The courtroom was silent, except for the clicking of pens and the quiet rustle of paper. Everyone was waiting to hear what had really happened inside that house, the one with the locked door, drawn curtains, and a secret buried beneath the soil. The prosecutor began with a single statement that gripped the entire room. This case isn't just about a burial. It's about abandonment, silence, and the erasure of a human life. Every word landed heavy. Over the next several hours, investigators laid out the evidence. Photos of the backyard, banking records, the timeline, and finally, the autopsy report that confirmed Jonathan had been left without care for months before his death. When the medical examiner took the stand, the courtroom could barely breathe. He explained how the evidence showed chronic neglect, a lack of nutrition, untreated illness, and isolation. Jonathan hadn't died suddenly. It had taken time. For many, that detail was the hardest to hear. Family members of Jonathan Kinman sat in the front row, tears silently rolling down their faces. They had trusted the Mitchells to care for him. Now they were learning how much he had suffered in his final days. Then came the defense. December's attorney argued that she had panicked, that she didn't know what to do when her son passed. That fear, not cruelty, guided her actions. She claimed she was ashamed and terrified of losing everything. But prosecutors pushed back. They presented receipts, showing purchases of tools, soil, and supplies made after Jonathan's death. They pointed to the ongoing withdrawals from his disability account. And they emphasized the weeks, not days, between his passing and the burial. The jury listened in silence. The evidence told a story that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the trial, even those who had come in neutral were shaken. The prosecutor's closing words echoed across the courtroom. When a child depends on you for survival and you turn away, that's not panic. That's choice. After several days of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. The room tensed. December Mitchell stood motionless, clutching her lawyer's hand. Her husband stared at the floor. The clerk read the words, "Guilty of tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse." The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others cried. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, December stood slowly, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I wish I could take it back. I didn't know what to do." But for Jonathan's family, the apology felt hollow. Nothing could bring back the son they had lost, or erase the horror of how he had been found. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "You made a decision to hide a truth that deserved light. And for that, there are consequences." He sentenced December Mitchell to 10 years in prison, with her husband facing additional time under federal review for financial fraud. As she was led out in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions she never answered. The family of Jonathan Kinman watched in silence. Justice had been served, but the victory felt heavy, not triumphant. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan's sister spoke to the press. Her words became the moment that would echo across every headline. "My brother didn't deserve this. He trusted people who took advantage of his innocence. I just want people to remember him, not for the way he died but for the way he lived." She described how Jonathan loved drawing, how he laughed at small things, how he never forgot birthdays. Her voice trembled, but her message was clear. This case wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. The community of Burleson changed after that day. What had begun as a mysterious call about a backyard grave became a story of truth, justice, and accountability. Jonathan's grave was moved to a proper cemetery, his name now carved in stone, surrounded by flowers, not secrets. The Mitchells lost their home, their reputation, and their freedom. But what lingered wasn't the punishment, it was the reminder that silence can be as damaging as violence. As the closing credits of this story fade, one question remains. How many more Jonathans are out there, unseen, unheard, and forgotten until it's too late? This story doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends as a call to action, to check on those who can't always speak for themselves. Because sometimes justice begins not with a badge or a gavel, but with one neighbor who decides to make a phone call. If you watched to this point, thank you for giving Jonathan's story a voice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the truth behind real cases. Your support helps keep these stories alive, because every life deserves to be remembered.